Hello, and welcome to the State of the Ship Learning Objective and Narrative Scheme. This video illustrates our hypothesis for a narrative structure designed with three objectives. 1. To motivate players through the LOs. 2. To complement the learning from the other LOs. And 3. To situate the decision biases in the context related to intel work. Progress of the narrative will change depending on choices that the players make. These choices represent the player's constructive critique of periodic intel reports about the state of the ship. In particular, we are interested in evaluating the player's ability to identify the potential for bias in intel reports constructed by others. This is bias on input from experienced intel instructors who report that using student peer evaluations is an effective pedagogical tool for alerting students to the potential for decision bias. There are 4 overarching pathways within the structure that the player can go down. Number 1. The optimal pathway reflects the choices of a player who's alert to the potential for confirmation, anchoring, and projection biases. This leads to a satisfying conclusion of the narrative with a detection and arrest of a potential saboteur. 2. Intermediate pathways reflect awareness for some of the biases, but not others. These pathways can lead to a satisfying conclusion, but it can take more iterations to get there. 3. A deviant pathway reflects the choices of a player who completely ignores any potential for bias. This pathway leads to a very unsatisfying conclusion. The game will be designed so that in addition to the standard LOs, players who deviate from the optimal path will get additional hints and instruction to help get them back on track toward a satisfying conclusion of the narrative. These simulations are designed to illustrate how the narrative might play out as a function of different players' skill levels. Here is an example of how a skilled player might proceed.
I'm not sure how anyone can really be 99% sure. There has to be some bias somewhere. I'm going to express some concern. I'm not going to anchor onto the reputation of this source, nor am I going to latch onto the 99%. Confirmation bias could be a factor. The assessment only searches for clues that indicate normal functioning. What about an alternative hypothesis? I think accounting for both biases is the best option.
The player has chosen to explore the possibility of both confirmation bias and anchoring, the correct pathway. At this point in the game, the player will be introduced to small LOs which will continue their decision training and evaluation.
Sabotage! I knew it! However, I can't let myself be a victim of confirmation bias. I still need to search for clues that support and oppose both hypotheses.
The player has discovered the alternative hypothesis of sabotage. He continues to other LO training exercises. In the next report, the potential of projection bias is introduced.
Now this assessment is projection bias all the way. The person giving the assessment is projecting their beliefs, behaviors, and attitudes onto the androids. They fail to see why the androids act the way they do. I'm raising the possibility of confirmation bias and projection bias.
The player continues their training with additional LOs until the next report.
A human now. Well, let's proceed with an open mind. I still have to be comprehensive in my search. I'll authorize this arrest and continue to be on the lookout. The saboteur may have an accomplice. I won! No surprise there, though. I'm an expert in detecting biases.
The player has correctly navigated their way through the narrative scheme and successfully avoided all biases. They would be given the maximum amount of points in that they found the shortest path to the successful resolution of finding the saboteur. Now let's look over the shoulder of a poor, inattentive player who fails to recognize the biases.
Well, this player is quite reputable. 99% sounds good to me. Onward!
The player has chosen to ignore the possibility of an alternative hypothesis and fails to recognize the biases behind each report. In addition to the standard LOs, this player will get some remedial training in hopes to get them back on track.
The idea that there are faulty parts doesn't seem biased. That's probably exactly what it is.
More LOs and additional remedial training is provided to get this player back on track.
It's probably just a fluke. 60% is still good. I'm doing the best I can, evaluator!
The player is given a warning by the evaluator as to their incompetence and advised to reevaluate their approach. Again, other learning objectives are reiterated.
The engineers are the only ones who can fix this problem. What else could it be? They are bound to find a solution. What happened?
The player has lost. The heuristica has blown up. They failed to recognize an alternative hypothesis or express concern for biased reports despite having played learning-oriented LOs in between decisions. The player must now re-enter training and work through learning objectives before they can try again. In the third example, we will simulate the perspective of the intermediate player, one who detects some bias but not all the time. This perspective will showcase the scheme's cross-linking branches, whereas the player is able to get on the correct path by making correct decisions at any point. Let's begin.
This assessment is coming from a reputable source and they sound very sure of their assessment. I think we can continue on for now.
The player is introduced to LOs to help them learn how to detect and mitigate biases.
Those LOs were fun. Now it's time for my next decision. Faulty parts? That seems reasonable. I'm going to continue. I think there is definitely a problem now. The person giving this assessment has to be biased. I think there is much more to this problem. I'm going to express concern for a biased assessment.
The intermediate player has successfully left the bias disregarding path and now has to choose one of the other three branches to explore.
It seems to me that the assessment was based on confirmation bias. Perhaps the one compiling the assessment was only searching for clues to support their hypothesis and not those for an alternative. I'm going to express concern for confirmation bias.
The player has entered the confirmation bias pathway and will be introduced to LOs geared toward detecting anchoring bias. These LOs will hopefully prep the player to pose the possibility of anchoring bias in future decisions.
Sabotage! I knew it had to be something else. Let's keep exploring sabotage. The crew doesn't seem that suspicious to me. I think I'll just accept the assessment and keep exploring sabotage.
Here, the player ignores anchoring bias and proceeds. They are given a warning about continued activity, specifically that androids are now acting suspicious. They are given further LOs directed toward detecting anchoring bias.
Those anchoring LOs surely opened my eyes. How did I miss it? Those wacky androids, if they are acting suspicious, it may be one of them. Or is it just the virus causing them to behave so oddly? This seems a bit out of the ordinary. I think we are anchoring onto this report. I think we should express concern for bias.
The intermediate player has successfully detected the anchoring bias and has found their way to the correct pathway. However, the correct pathway now introduces the projection bias. Let's see if the player can successfully detect and navigate their way around it.
Aha! Maybe it is the androids after all. More evidence. Let's keep going.
The player has fallen prey to projection bias. They are now exposed to LOs geared towards teaching about projection bias, perhaps like the evacuate LO.
Those projection LOs really made me see my errors. I was projecting my beliefs onto the androids. I was also only searching for evidence against the androids. Such confirmation bias. I need to express concern.
The player has now avoided projection bias and is back on the correct pathway. Let's see if they can make it to the end.
A human now. Good thing I chose wisely. I'll be sure to proceed with alternative hypotheses in mind. I think we got him. However, there may be more. I did it! The Heuristica is surely safe under my command.
The player has won! They have successfully traversed their way through multiple paths and ended up at the winning stage. Along the way, they were introduced to learning objectives, which helped guide them to make correct decisions by learning how to detect biases. Overall, this structural narrative will supplement learning objectives by exposing the player to lesson-based decision-making outside of the minigames. Note that there are other conclusions embedded in the narrative for players who do not take full advantage of the learning opportunities. Thank you for watching, and for those of you wondering what other atrocities could have doomed the Heuristica, here's a sneak peek.